Hi, everyone. Welcome to Game Changer Sessions. For those of you whose first time it is to Game Changer Sessions, Game Changer Sessions is a weekly live stream where we bring brilliant minds and warm hearts to our innovation community to really share their wisdom and specifically focused on how do we not just survive during these really uncertain and changing times, but how do we actually thrive? And also, how do we create the future, and not just any future, but a future that we actually want to live in? And this is week 11 of Game Changer Sessions. We've had some amazing guests before. Adam Grant, Margaret Atwood, Roger Martin, Albert Wenger, Minister Navdeep Bains, just to name a few. And next week, on Monday, our guest is going to be Boris Wertz, one of Canada's top venture capitalists, focused on creating the future that we want and what the future holds. And it is with great honor and a privilege that I bring to you a dear friend of mine and somebody who I think has a really important voice right now, Jennifer Holness. Jen is the president and founder of Hungry Eyes Media. Jen is an award-winning producer and screenwriter, and she brings powerful stories to the screen in all different sizes, including the CBC series Shoot the Messenger, Guns, and recently Stateless, which recently won the Grand Jury Prize at the Hot Docs for Best Canadian Documentary. Really excited to have Jen here today to talk about so many things, including the power of stories to change the world, the reality of systemic racism in the US and Canada, and how we can all be helpful, how we can all create a future we want. So welcome, Jen. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Candice. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of Game Changer. I love the title, and I love the idea that this conversation, will be a part of the zeitgeist in game-changing ways.
I, I love that too, and it's a real honor to have you here. I know I've known you in so many contexts over the past few years, and you've always been a game changer. Certainly to me, I've always wanted to learn more and know more of your story. And I think there's never been a more opportune time to share your wisdom right now. It's deeply, deeply needed. And maybe just to get started, Jen, why don't we sort of start from the beginning? Tell us a little bit about you and your journey, certainly, in Canada and in film.
Okay, thank you. So I am a writer and a producer, and I run my own production company. And my partner is a really fantastic director, in my partner in life and in my work, Sutherland. And so we own this company together. And so when we began, I mean, I'm actually an immigrant. I came to Canada. I was very young, around 6, and Sud was born here. And so we've had the challenges and the wonderful. Both the challenges and some of the wonderful elements of being a part of a country like Canada. And so growing up, there was and there continues to be systemic racism. I mean, it manifests itself in many ways, but the beauty about this country was that however it existed, we felt that we could succeed. There wasn't, I have to say them, and maybe this is one of the differences perhaps, is that we felt that there was a way to actually get where we wanted to be. And that was as filmmakers. So I met Suds at university, and he just said, hey, let's form a film company together. And I was actually doing poli-sci, no connection to film whatsoever. And I said, okay. So we actually immediately formed a company. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to create content, creative work that tapped into and looked at the stories of diverse people and Black people in particular, because we felt growing up there was so little opportunities or material available or created that reflected us, our realities, our communities, our stories. And so that was really, really important to us. And in fact, Hungry Eyes the name, it's meant as film as food for hungry eyes. So we wanted to bring that to the table. So from the very beginning of our journey as filmmakers, it was about telling these diverse stories from our points of view. And that's been the guiding principle of our company, whether we work in drama or documentaries, short films, even digital. That's always a part of the work we sought to do.
That's amazing. I mean, it's first of all, I love the name. Like just the idea of Hungry Eyes makes so much sense to me, and I think you know recognizing the importance of being seen, right, in the media and in stories in powerful ways. Tell the audience more about some of the work that you've created. What are some of the themes? What are some of the narratives? What's important to you in creating narratives around diverse audiences?
Mhm. Well, I think number one is always authentic stories. The first film we did, actually, and this is really important. The first, I think, important film we did was a short film called My Father's Hands, and it was essentially my partner's story. It was about a Caribbean man who ran. He was a butcher, and he had a son who was an artist, and he did not believe that his son should be an artist, and so there was a conflict. They didn't talk to each other, and which is very, very common to the sort of the black community. And the story is essentially about the two of them. They're working one night. The kid's about to go off to university. It's his last day working with his father. One gets shot in the hand, one gets shot in the foot. They're locked in a freezer, and they're left to confront each other. And what they go through is the memories of their life together before they die, and it's looking at the things that split them apart and the things that came together. That was a really important film to us because My Father's Hand actually won this HBO prize. It aired on HBO. It was a short film. It traveled the whole world. We were nominated for Canadian Genies at the time, for best writing, best picture, best directing, and it really told us at that point that these kinds of stories that were so unique to like the spin of it, because it was very much based on Suds's, my partner's life growing up. The spin that we brought to the table was valuable, but at the same time, even from that film, moving on to Love, Sex, and Eating Bones, which was our first feature, and it won the best first feature at TIFF. And that was a really unique story as well. It was about a black guy, a young black man who was an artist, and he was really frustrated, and he was addicted to pornography, and he meets this amazing girl, but he can't get it up. And so it was a comedy, and we had a lot of fun making it. Ed Robertson was in it, and because Ed Robertson and Suds had actually gone to a school together growing up in Scarborough. And so it was, though, a uniquely Canadian film. It traveled as well. We won a whole bunch of festival awards, the film really did well for us. But again, it was another example of bringing our own unique spin to the work. But what we found was, and this is where the systemic parts come in, I think we found is that the opportunities when you make even award-winning films that are well reviewed and has interest in audiences are interested in, there are barriers. So, for example, one of the things that happened is that we would go down to Cineplex, and we would be like, hey, go check out this movie. We'd accost audiences. Go check out this Canadian film. And a lot of people did, and particularly diverse people. But we had a number of people say, well, why would I want to watch this black film? And so, there was an entrenched idea, I think, in some minds that this is not my story because it's from the diverse community. And the thing is, as filmmakers and as citizens, we as black folks, we watch everything. It's about the material being very good. So those are some of the systemic things that we were aware of very young into a career. But then we continued on. We had 3 children. And then we started to move into television. And one of the things we did was Guns, which was a miniseries that actually won 5 Genies, or Canadian Academies, best directing, best writing. I co-wrote it with Suds, best editing, a bunch of awards. One of our actors won the ACTRA award, which goes to one male actor a year. So it again really successful in that sense, and we actually had fairly good sales. We had Alicia Cuthbert in the series. All of these things, we put these great elements together, but we still found major challenges, primarily because the international market has this sort of idea about Black content and what do you do with narratives that come from different communities, and we were told numerous times. I've been told many times as a producer that um, international audiences don't want this work, or international sales are going to be low. And there's like three Black actors, Denzel at the time, I think, Will Smith, and maybe Halle Berry were like the only three actors in the whole world that could actually generate international audiences. And so those kinds of systemic ideas, and so it's built in, so you get less money. So, people don't actually look at the work. So these are some of the systemic issues, but that we face, and frankly, some of it born out of anti-Black racism. But we have continued to make films and television shows. We continue to
Mm-hmm.
believe that diverse stories from the point of view of some of the diverse creators out there, that it's really important. And I think that in the last 3 or 4 years, certainly since the Oscar So White campaign, led by, for example, Jada Pinkett Smith, you know, um, and predominantly Black, super powerful artists, led this conversation, that said, you know, we should not continue to be marginalized. Our work, our content, our performers, our voices should not be marginalized. And the interesting thing is, every time they invest a significant dollars into, so like a diverse point of view, like look at Black Panther. I mean, some of it becomes um, surprising to some, not surprising to us, surprising to some, but because we know that if you give us the tools and the resources, because we're often underfunded, give us the same resources, we can deliver. So it's been a challenge, and it's been difficult. And there, the last couple of weeks, I think I told you this, Candice, I've been in tears. I've been uplifted. I've been, the deepest parts of depression because of what's unfolding in front of me. But
Mm-hmm.
but
Well,
but I'm here.
yeah, absolutely. And I think, you made a few really interesting points to me. One is just not giving up in the face of it, right? It's like the persistence, and the running a company that's been really purposeful in having these stories told, because you really recognize the power of having these stories in the world, and no doubt, I'm sure, it sounds like you have faced a lot of pushback or a lot of implicit, racism that's accrued as a result, but just you've continued on in creating a future that does, value these stories. I'm really curious. The last few weeks have been very intense. This has become the zeitgeist of the moment, obviously with George Floyd, obviously with Trump's, comments and behaviors. Do you feel like this is a different moment in the world, understanding that systemic racism exists? What's your sense of this?
Yeah. I do think I genuinely feel like this is a moment that we're living, just like COVID, we're living through an unprecedented moment in the stories of Black people in North America, Europe, and globally. Now, this is the interesting thing. It's been very difficult over the last 3 or so years to observe the some of the most powerful people on the planet dismissing actively attacking, marginalizing, comments, calling a black woman a dog, all these kinds of things from, and it's been terrifying also because at the same time you felt like anything could happen. And anything has been happening. The George Floyds of the world, that the Sandra Brands, all of that stuff had been happening my whole life. But for the first time, it looks like it's not just us as the Black community that is hurt by this, that understands how deep this runs. For the first time in my life, I truly feel like people are reaching out in a way I've never seen. And a part of it is pledging money, part of it is pledging their intentions to listen. Part of it is actually becoming a part of the conversation. Because historically, you could not say words like white people to white people. You couldn't say white women to white women. You couldn't say white, because just that alone, people would get so, their backs would get up. They would be so defensive, so defensive.
Mm,
So you couldn't even have a conversation. So all of the things that have been happening, I think two of the most important thing for me is one is the sense that we're actually being seen and we're being heard, right?
mhm.
Is where I think the real changes
Yeah.
could possibly happen.
Yeah, and I think that's so powerful, you saying that, since so much of your life's work is about people seeing and hearing diverse voices, and I will say, for me, I certainly have sort of stepped back in a different way
Mm.
to really question and reflect on, do I really understand how systemic racism is? And, one of the big insights for me is I'm an immigrant to this country too. So I came here and I'm Canada's biggest fan in many ways, right? Like I come from South Africa, a place that, has a horrible history of racism and apartheid. And the there's a part of me that wants to believe that Canada is much better than it actually is as it relates to systemic racism. And I thought there was a really beautiful quote in a CTV article just last week, which said, "It's difficult for Canadians to hold in their minds at the same time this idea, this fervent belief that they live in a democratic and even multicultural society and that racism can exist in this society." And it's certainly been my experience this, past few weeks of really understanding some of the data and the evidence that really shows how systemic racism is,
Mhm.
not just in the US, in Canada, as well. And it doesn't mean that we don't live in a great country. It just means that there's still a lot more work to do, is the way, I'm interpreting it. But I think it's important to sort of look at what the impact of the systemic racism is in Canada and the US. And, one of the first things or first ideas that I found really, really quite really sad in many ways is the relationship between Black youth and education and expectations. And, one of the stats that I saw is the data shows that Black youth are keen to achieve a higher education. 94% of Black young people aged 15 to 25 surveyed said that they would complete a university degree, but only 59% thought it was possible.
Mhm.
And the gap between hope and expectation doesn't exist for the rest of the population. So 82% of other groups surveyed said that they wanted to achieve a university education, and 78% believed that they could. And so I'm really curious, like, why do you think that is? What is that about, that
Yeah.
belief system versus the want?
Yes. It's an excellent question, and as you know, I have three daughters, and I have been dealing with this these last 2 weeks. some really interesting experiences about one in particular. So my middle daughter goes to a very academically excellent school. She had to do an SSAT, a math test, a written test, and an interview to get into the school. She is, in fact, the only Black kid in her grade. And so this is what's really important. And she's done well. There's never been a year that she's come home with a report card where her average was lower than 90. Okay? So let's talk. So now here is a young Black girl who has worked really hard to get into this school, maintains great grades, comes home in tears. They're like completely destroyed at times because within the student population, for example, there is a narrative that as a Black person, she's less smart, that she's less able to accomplish things, that you know all the gangster stereotypes aren't necessarily placed on her, but but the community, the Black community that she's a part of, that's some of the conversation, a part of the narrative that's thrown at her. She's had to defend students using the N word, and and she's told that she's a social justice warrior in a negative way. So what I'm trying to say is that if you are going into a school population and you're achieving a high average, all these kinds of things, and you're experiencing that. Imagine and we have resources. We're middle class folk. We're downtown folk. We live downtown, so we travel. So we have all the language. We have all the defenses. We talk about anti-Black racism at home. I mean, they're sick to death of me, sharing stuff, and so they know the story. They know what's going down. But the thing is that that kind of what they face is so demoralizing. That is where I think the gap between expectations and belief is, because what I say is that there are some in my community, in my Black community that I hold so dear, that don't have the same educational opportunities that I've given my kid, who are told within the school system that they're dumb. Even my own experience, Candice, I mean, I wanted to bring something from today, but my own experience was that I was told when I said, I didn't know what I wanted to be. My mother wanted to be a lawyer, and I had, a good average. I was really, I did, I think they called it advanced at that time, and I knew I was going to go to university. I felt like I was going to go to university, and my guidance counselor said, "Oh, you want to be a lawyer? You should think about being a secretary, right?"
Mm-hmm.
And I have all the respect in the world for secretaries, but my grade average,
Yeah.
and I didn't come in the room saying I wanted to be a secretary. I came into the room saying, so the point I'm trying to make is that these are the things, and I could, I'll let you say something, but my husband, just one last thing, is what grew up in, he was gifted, and he grew up in the gifted systems. He couldn't get, for example, and so he was treated well in the sense that he was like one of the few Black kids in that whole school in that gifted program, but he couldn't get like a part-time job that didn't involve lifting or in a factory, because the society, the community saw him as a threat, So these are the things that create that gap.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I thought just going back to this another article, it says, you know, the most profound finding was how strongly Black youth in Toronto pushed back against the idea that the greatest violence they had faced in the communities was physical violence. They insisted that the most sustained daily violence was the violence of the education system, in which teachers who did not believe in them, who stereotyped them, who over disciplined them, and who over punished them, who constructed possibilities for them that were different from the possibilities of other children. And I just thought that was like very aligned with what you're saying. Like, here you are, this mother who I know is just like a phenomenal, mother who believes so deeply in the potential of her children, but surrounded by a narrative, that maybe is stereotyped against specifically Black people as a minority group, and I really, I just want to say, like, I really hear you around that, and I think it's something that, what gives me hope is that we're having these conversations so people can be more aware, but it's also, in this multicultural country, systemic racism doesn't just look like explicit hate,
Oh, good point.
explicit brutality. And I think that's been, for me, as just somebody who wants to learn and wants to sort of process and understand, it's actually all the implicit. It's all the small things. It's like the death by 1,000 cuts, that I'm sort of becoming more aware of. Um, I want to move on, and I want to talk a little bit about Canada versus the US.
Mhm.
Do you see any big differences in the way society is for Black people in Canada versus in the US? Have you experienced that, or how do you think about the US versus Canada right now?
Yeah, no, I think about the US a lot because I think I got a lot of my culture, my understanding of Blackness from the US because Canada does a woefully poor job of exposing, supporting, showing, creating work by, for example, Black people. And so, but one of my first films I did was a film for the National Film Board called Speakers for the Dead, and it was a documentary that exposed that the blacks were some of the first non-native settlers in Ontario, and in that Grey County area, they created communities, and in some cases, they were actually physically and violently pushed out of their community. And the thing about making that film was, I talked to some of the real old timers, and and these are Black Canadians whose families have been here for 100 year or so, and they said this is the thing. They said there weren't the signs. The signs weren't there. And so what they're talking about are the signs that says whites only. There weren't the signs, but it was the same. And I think for me, that's always been my understanding of Canada and the U.S. So, for example, in the U.S., there is a lot more uh, overt racism. People spewing to you, get out of my face. You can't come here. We don't, we work here together in this space, but we never cross pollinate in a social setting, right? My whole experience, I've cross pollinated in a social setting, right? A lot of my friends look like you, Candice. A lot of my friends are Black. A lot of my friends are Asian. So I cross pollinate. People are in my home. So in the U.S., that's one of the biggest differences, that it's very overt and in your face. But make no mistake, the U.S. is actually further ahead in some areas. For example, in the entertainment business, I mean, some of the top writers in America are African American. Sandra Rhimes, I'm thinking Kenya Barnes. I mean, you look at uh, Oprah Winfrey, in terms of the power and because I'm talking about my industry, so I'm just looking at those things. So, so you have to say to yourself, if Canada is so, um, um, if Canada doesn't have these real systemic issues of anti-Black racism, why is it that I'm sure nobody can actually think about a Black Canadian that's occupied a huge space in entertainment, politics, or pretty much any marker that hasn't had to go to the U.S., like Drake, for example, right? When you look at corporations, when you look at places like the CBC or Telefilm, these are organizations, arts-run agencies. Ontario Creates, CMPA, which is our Producers Association. 100% of the board members or staff is white. Okay, so we are so willing to pat ourselves on our backs about how great we are. But what we don't realize that we're perpetuating the same kinds of outcomes because until recently, we really have not made um, any real attempt to have our boardrooms, our entertainment business, our legal business reflect the populations. So, even with lawyers and judges and all these, how many of the judges are diverse people? How many of the politicians or the directors and corporations are people of color, BIPOC people? It does not, it's actually less present here than it is in the US. So we think violence is the only marker of how well we're doing, right? I've had, and one last thing, I've had Black Americans come here and say, wow, wow, this is unbelievable. We thought we were coming to this oasis, but we can't get a job. And when we get a job, we're kept here. So it's
Right.
interesting. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think just to focus on that. I mean, I think there's a really interesting statistic about how Canada is a country of immigrants, but not all immigrants are treated equal. There are certain ethnic minorities that are prized, and there are
Yes.
others that are really discriminated against. And you just there's like going back to the data. I think it's interesting to see two things. One, first generation Black Canadians, people who've just come here, their average income is $37,000 compared to the average income of $50,000 for new immigrants who are not members of a visible minority. And it doesn't go away is a big part of the problem, is that Canadians make an average income of 32, third generation Black immigrants make an average of $32,000 compared with $48,000. And I think that's just one of those, important elements. And I also, just moving to the US and moving more broadly to what has, COVID done for the Black community, I think that's where you really start to see the systemic issues. So, according to a New York Times article, it sort of details out on a bunch of different areas how, unfortunately, Black people are really getting worse, like getting the worst end of being hit by the pandemic right now. And so
Mhm.
maybe I'd love to talk to you a little bit about that. What do you what do you think is going to be the impact on the Black community of COVID? Specifically, some of the stats are really scary, right? Basically, employment right now, I think there's a stat that says less than half of Black adults now have a job in the US. I mean, think about that, right? It's first fired, last
50%,
hired, right? And,
50%
and
unemployment. Crazy.
that is like a staggering number. I mean, it's a US number. I don't know the Canadian number, but that's really, really scary, for a community to be facing that. I think the other stat that I found really scary is just in times where there is uncertainty and where you may have to have a cushion or some kind of cushion. The typical Black household has 1/10 the wealth of a typical white household right now. And that means that they're, far more likely to not be able to cover their expenses during this time where, the entire society has pulled back. And I think it's, in looking at some of this data around just um, how broadly impacted a community is really important in understanding the systemic nature of the problem.
You said a lot. There's a lot, and all of it is powerful and scary. I mean, I just want to backtrack and just say I think there's a third thing that has to happen. In addition to the fact that I feel like we're being seen and heard, we need to be supported. We need allies. And we need allies who are going to recognize some of the things that you just raised, some of the points you raised, and say, how can we help? Because help is needed. So, look, I mean, let's see now. You talked about unemployment rates and how COVID impacts at a higher rate of infection and death in the Black community. I'll start there. At the start of the pandemic, um, and I should say I got COVID, and I'll talk about that later. But just before everything hit, um, my youngest daughter, who's 13, came home and said, "Oh, this COVID thing, and because people are still going to school at that time, this COVID thing. Oh, but Black people are immune." And I said, "What?" She goes, "Yeah, no, no. It's on Twitter or whatever it's saying, or on Instagram. It's like saying Black people are immune." And so I don't know if you saw when Idris Alba got COVID, even though he had no symptoms, because he was one of those lucky COVID people that they get it and it's mild symptoms. He came out and he said, "Black people, you need to understand, we get this. We are getting this and we're dying from it. So please protect yourself." So this is also part of the anti-Black racism. For whatever reason, um, pandemics, whether medical pandemics and so forth, they have been met with this idea that Black folks somehow are these alien beings with different blood, different whatever. So we are often told, "Oh, you're not going to get it because you're Black, you're different," and so forth. And then we're actually put on the front lines. Historically, Black people have been on the front lines of medical situations. They're the first bodies that are put out there, right? And they're the least protected. So I just thought it was, and I just thought it was fascinating that a 13-year-old come home and tell her parent that she had heard that Black folks don't get it. So then we discover, and then of course, then everything shuts down, and people are like, "Oh, this is scary. What are we going to do? This is terrifying. It's like the War of the Worlds without the aliens. The world is going crazy. We're shutting down." And then everyone's panicked and they're scared. And then we start seeing this news that says, well, Black people are like 30 to 70% more likely to die from this or to get this and die. And suddenly you have people rolling out of their houses saying, "Let's bring back the economy." Now, I believe in the economy, but see, these are the manifestations of anti-Black racism. We're different. We don't have the same, we don't hurt the same way. Black women are dying in hospital in childbirth. We used to be breeders. This is what we were brought to these lands for. And we're dying in hospitals at 7 to 10 times the rate of white women, right? So we can't even have babies anymore. So, but what I'm trying to say is that we're part of the reason that's happening, though, is that in the medical institutions, they don't see Black women's pain. When a Black woman says they're hurt or something is wrong, they don't listen. I mean, Serena Williams almost died, and she's a very wealthy, powerful Black woman. She almost died because of this exact same thing. So we're seen as different somehow. We don't feel pain the same way other people do. We don't experience pandemics or medical situations, so we don't need to be protected. But then the minute people find out we're dying from it, then it's like, oh, let's open up the salons, let's open up the nail shops, let's open up the places that Black people love to congregate because we love some nails and some hair. I mean, so that to me is anti-Black racism is ingrained in that, right?
Mhm.
And how COVID has been seen, for example, and the fact that Black folks are dying and are getting infected at higher rates speaks to how unprotected we are. Because what it means is that we are in neighborhoods where we don't have the same kind of access to fresh fruits and vegetables, cheap food that it makes you sick. So
Yeah.
diabetes become a problem. So all these underlying conditions is the factor that why Black folks are dying at a higher level. And so,
Uh,
it, sorry, I just want I'm going on very long, but
Not
I'm
at
just
all.
saying,
Go ahead.
yeah. But it just speaks to being unprotected in this society. Yeah. So that's what I'm saying.
No, I think what you just said, which is there are real systemic issues, right? Like when you don't have enough money to purchase food that is healthy or to have protective gear, or 17% are frontline workers, or most people are in jobs, that are being exposed, even if it's not frontline workers per se, or you have unemployment and you have that stress, that's a systemic problem. So I really hear you. So Jen, we don't have too much time left before we take it to questions. There's so much I want to still ask you. I'm going to just quickly ask you, you made a comment and you went very quickly over it, which said you had COVID.
Oh,
How are you doing? Are you okay? What was that experience like for you?
yeah. It was difficult. I mean, I was lucky. So I was traveling a lot. I was actually in Europe. I was in the U.S. Back and forth travel. In fact, I don't think I traveled so much in my life. And I remember I came. So I came in January. I got very sick, and there was no conversation about COVID. And in fact, I just thought I had a flu. Well, my immune system was weak the whole time, though, from January until March. And I went to Berlin in February, end of February. And when I came back, it was just, it hit me, this thing. And it was like, high fever. My chest was like on fire. I could breathe, but it was just like, for me, it felt like it was just so painful. And I've had ongoing headaches, which I still have now. The fever, the coffee, and all that stuff, weird things like diarrhea. It's very strange. Uh, yeah, but I've had these ongoing headaches, which I still have, and sometimes I can't. And I never used to have headaches at all. And I have another medical condition. I had a brain aneurysm. And I wonder if it's something to do with the fact there's a clip in my brain because I have these ongoing symptoms. So that was difficult. And my husband got sick, and he was sick for about a week and a half. And then one of my kids was sick for 5 days, and then the other two just had like a cough, and they're like, ugh, whatever. So, but it was tough, and it was difficult. And I know for many weeks I have not felt healthy or strong, and very cloudy in my mind. Um, and then other weird little things. So it's been difficult, but I live in a home where we have a big backyard, so I have people, well, I have my family around me. So, I think about people who don't have those kinds of resources, don't have anyone with them helping to take care of them, how lonely and debilitating that must be. Also, because we're in an amazing country on many levels, and we have a prime minister who really has stepped up. I mean, I've always been a fan of Mr. Trudeau. I know some people aren't, but I've always been. Um, um, he stepped up to the plate and protected the citizens of this country, and so we didn't have to sort of like panic or one of the stats you talked about. Black folks are not getting the same kinds of access to the funds available that we have. There's no barriers here. If you
Mm-hmm.
have the need, you're able to access it. So
Yeah.
all those
I'm
things
glad
have
that you
been,
brought that up. Yeah. Yeah,
yes,
for
all
sure. I
those
mean,
things.
so first off, I'm so glad that you're feeling at least a bit better, and I think you're right. I mean, for me, this experience has made me super aware of my privilege of, living in a nice house and having a backyard, and my privilege of living in Canada, and I think the point that you made, it's like people, one of my principles that I'm very big on is this idea of duality, right? It's like, yes, there are things that can be, not great and amazing about a particular place. And so for me, the recognition that,
Mhm.
maybe Black voices aren't heard as much here, but no matter who you are, you access CERB, right? Or you are
Yeah,
protected as a citizen in Canada, I think is
yeah.
a really big thing that
Mhm.
you pointed out that I strongly believe as well. Let's move for the last, few minutes to, so what do people do, right? How do people
Mhm.
actually be true allies and
Mhm.
help? What are some of the things that you found incredibly helpful from people who, are not part of the Black community but want to support the Black community? what kinds of things can
Hmm.
people like myself do to really help in our
Yeah.
community?
Well, first of all, speak up. So when you're seeing something that you think is not quite right, speak up. Or even if it's just an inkling or a feeling, or or if you even see somebody who you think might be struggling a little bit, take them aside and say, "Hey, I see you. Is there something you need? This is what I know." Because one of the interesting things is that we're often socialized outside of the dominant culture. When you go to places like Scarborough and Etobicoke, that is absolutely what's happening. So speak up and be an ally. Offer up support. These are really important. Offer up financial assistance. The fact is, when you say that in America, the wealth is it's 10 times greater between the white and black community. Okay, that means that contrary to what some of the white supremacists, the white rights narrative, black people are taking over. I mean, how could you take over when the averages are so massive? So what it means is that you know put your money where your mouth is. Support organizations like Black Lives Matter, but not just Black Lives Matter. Support organizations that fund COVID relief. Hire Black folks, and when you do hire them, understand that they often come from a different kind of socialization within communities, and this is really important because this is part of my experience. Um, I went to diverse schools for the most part, and I always had diverse friends. In fact, within my community, people used to say, "What is wrong with you? Why are you hanging out with them white people too? You just need to hang out with us." And I'd be like, "Well, no, it's like I don't." For me, I was like, "Well, I'm just interested in people." But what that means is that you're socialized in a very, sometimes, other than what television shows you, a very narrative framework. So for example, even though I had this experience of being more reaching out to different folks, when I moved downtown and had my first job, I didn't drink because my mother was a Christian mom, right? I barely had coffee. I think once I had coffee once or twice. I mean, all these cultural things that Canadians do. Like, can you imagine a young Canadian in their 20s who doesn't drink? Those kinds of things. So I had to learn how to be, there was things that people talked about and valued that wasn't stuff that we talked about and valued. And so what you have to understand is that sometimes when a black person comes into your environment, they might have that completely different experience. And so it's not that they're being standoffish. It's just that they're terrified actually because they feel like they might not fit in, they might not belong. So I think it's on the white community, the larger global white community, to be the ones to take the steps, to be the ones to say we are going to correct it. And also, when a black person or diverse from someone in the BIPOC community tells you something about them and what their needs are, don't tell them that it's this instead. I've had so many experiences where people, well-meaning, they approach us with a paternalism that comes from slavery. Now, slavery was horrible. It was degrading. It was brutal. But the narrative that was spun post-slavery was we were these simple folk who needed to be taken care of. And that narrative still is a part of how white folks see black folks without even realizing it. So when black folks are in a space, they often think, well, the black person said they need this, but they don't really need this. We know what they need. This is what I think is the solution. And so don't be that person. Listen, work with.
Thank you. I think that's really, really great advice. And it just goes back to the point you made and your purpose and the work that you're doing, which is just having people feel seen and heard. I think that's really, really important. And, for me, I absolutely think it's about having people feel seen and heard and taking action, right? And so, thank you very much, Jen. We're going to go to questions in a moment. So I know there's quite a few questions from our Game Changer community, but thank you for truly being a game changer in the work that you're doing and in sharing your voice. And I feel very privileged. I know you're amazing, amazing family. And just so people know. Hi, everyone. Hi, Jen. As you could see, we actually pre-recorded our conversation about an hour ago due to some scheduling challenges. But we are live right now. Jen's right there. I'm here. Hi, Jen. And we actually have some great questions from the community. So I'm going to move to those. The first question we have is, what is your perspective on defunding the police?
That's a good one. Okay, I think that we have to understand it from the point of view of Black folks, and that the police was actually an organization that came about to catch slaves. That's where the first police. So inherent to how the organization was developed, it was to, in fact, hunt down. They were the first slave catchers. So that has been embedded in my mind into the DNA. So the police has actually not really existed to aid the Black community, is actually has been employed and was created to seek and destroy our communities on one level. So that's number one. So that said, we need the police. We need some. We need a place we want to call 911, and something is terrible happening. You need to have a place to go to, and I believe that there are a large number of police officers that come to the job with good intentions. But what needs to happen is to really look at how that money is being spent very carefully in consultation with lawmakers that are from the diverse communities. Mm-hmm. So decisions, I actually think it's not so much defund the police, but to reorganize some of the money, perhaps take out some of the vast amount of money that's been put into law enforcement and put it into community building, for example. So I think we have to really look at that money and look at how it's being used.
Thank you. We have about only 3 minutes left. So
oh my gosh!
Really, really quickly. Maybe I'll just ask one or two more of these questions. I really like this question specifically about elementary school teachers, grades 1 to 5. What can elementary school teachers do?
They need to get educated and understand that they are in fact a part of the problem in many, many situations. They are the first line of what our kids learn and see. And if they don't come with anti-Black racism training and understanding, then they're part of the problem.
Sure.
It's on them.
Absolutely. One other question, which I think is a great one that a lot of people are asking, and I certainly have some resources to share, but I think it would be great to get your perspective, which is, where can people donate? Maybe after this, we can just actually tweet out on social some places. Or if there's a specific organization that you're really passionate about, Jen, feel free to share it.
There's a few of them. So what I will do, I will actually tweet out. I mean, obviously Black Lives Matter is one of the obvious one. There's an organization called 100 Strong that supports young Black males. There's Black Women Film, again, being a filmmaker, that supports Black women in film and television. So I would love to tweet out some of that information.
Absolutely. So I think we have time for one more question here. And, we have another question here which says, we need to measure the stats. We need the measures and the stats. How do we measure impact without it appearing to be racial profiling?
Okay, first, just understand that it is not racial profiling. We've been sold a bill of goods. We're the only country, one of the few countries, I can't say the only one, that does not collect these statistics. And what it means is that we're able to continue this behavior. These systemic problems never get addressed because we don't have the numbers. We aren't offended. Black people are not offended by statistics. Find the statistics. And actually, but what we're offended by is who gets to analyze the statistics, because that's where the danger really is. It's not the collection of statistics. It's who's analyzing and reporting on it.
For sure. Well, Jen, thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for, allowing us to record this earlier and come back on live. We hope it didn't cause too much of an inconsistent experience, but it has been a real honor and pleasure having you on our Game Changer series and hearing your voice and your wise words. So thank you very much for all that you do and for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Candice. This is great. Thank you, everyone. And remember, work on anti-Black racism. Black Lives Matters.
Awesome. Great. And so just before we go, a big thank you to our production partner, Either Live, who produces this show, executive produced by Corey Marr, with special thanks to Maroon Tadas. And the artwork in my back is from a friend, Lindsay Holland. And it's actually great. It says "Against the Odds," which I think is so appropriate and great. And we have great partners. So CBC Toronto, thank you. CIX, which is a new partner. We're delighted to have you on board. Toronto Life, Talk Boutique, Artery, York University, and TechTO. Thank you all for being partners in bringing these Game Changer sessions to the community. Have a really great weekend, folks. And thanks again, Jen. Take care.